Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout 3 for Shawn, Kristen, and Cinthia. First, let me start by saying that I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very well researched, and you had a high situational awareness because you did your homework on the incident action plan. And I really liked how you laid out all the ICS forms that would be part of the incident action planning. And at some point in the presentation, Kristen referred to the planning P, and the top portion of the planning P being the operational cycle, past the initial notification and actions of the first phase of the incident. So I really think that really situated your discussion around the specific geographic area. You could anchor your conversations around some geographic reference points, and I thought that was a really, really huge contribution to this discussion. And I know that Kristen consulted somebody in the catastrophic planning unit at HPD, so really nice job on that. And certainly, what was interesting, you mentioned the sensitivity issue with planning like that. And certainly I do understand that. So if you want to take that post of the public folder, please do so. So let me start just by some of the preparations that you did. You looked at the ICS form 201 of the incident briefing form, and you filled it out with organizational structures to include the branches, the divisions, and the groups. And you included the Houston Police Department, Harris County Sheriff's Office as the lead law enforcement agencies. You talked about Harris County, Houston divisions, the federal division to include Homeland Security and Department of Justice, who will notably in this event that you picked come to the federal coordination, and they would establish the joint field office. You also included the metro in the Houston area for transportation purposes planning, and the rails, which if you are, a few of you are aware of the Houston area, there is a rail coming through there as well. You did look at the issues of 600 volunteers and how they would be integrated in the planning and ultimately the response to the event. So with some planning considerations, you also mentioned the special operations for intelligence gathering pre-event, local and national resources, contacting media, and also looking at social media activity. You mentioned the access to cameras in Houston area, and certainly that would be coordinated through TransStar, which is located in Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And of course, those cameras also fed into Houston Emergency Center, because as you know, there are two emergency operations centers for emergency management coordination in Houston, one being at HEC, Houston Emergency Center, that would be for the city, and the other one that I mentioned where the TransStar is located for the Harris County. So you've got two coordinating entities with overlapping jurisdictions. You also looked at the layout, geographical layout, and the major thoroughfares that would be considered in this event, being Memorial Parkway and Allen Parkway. And what I really liked, you from the get-go was established and discussed the unified command and the field command post or incident action post. You also discussed how what the proximity was of the Houston Police Department and particular stations to in close proximity. You mentioned Homeland Security investigations. So as part of Homeland Security, you would have them involved, and also the bomb squads for sweeps, the Ordnance Division, and certainly medical issues, and fire within the all hazards approach. And I think you referred to the movie Dirty War, with the expectation of possible fires, since you picked the explosions. You also brought in the organizers of the rodeo, being it a private part of that private-public organization and planning, which was very good that you did not forget those, and they would be included in a command structure. You also talked about aerial resources and for both intelligence and also to be included in the planning. You also mentioned the fusion center that would need to be integrated for intelligence gathering purposes pre and during the event. I think that you also mentioned that the rodeo, there's a digital radio system and interoperable communications, and that was specifically meaningful when you discussed your form ICS 205 on communications for ICS. And on the 205, you laid it out really nicely. You discussed the general broadcasting. So you mentioned channel 8 for general communications, and then several 12, 13, 14, I've got my notes here for tactical channels. As far as planning for medical capability, you talked about setting up the first aid tents and getting Houston Fire Department involved in that, and also including in planning considerations the special response group or quick reaction force, or so to speak, the riot or control group, and discussed on how it would be critical in the planning of that as additional support to SWAT. When looking at, so you had a really good breakdown on your 202s and 203s, which, you really got into the detail of planning, which I really enjoyed because it brings in that ICS and standardization component and the importance of getting the documentation for accountability reasons. When you looked at the particular mission areas in the event that you picked the multiple explosions with vehicle-borne improvised explosive devices and suicide bombers. And at some point you had some discussion, which one would happen first, which one would happen next, and where you would want them located and how you would look at mitigating that. So you talked about hospitalizations, the amount of people in that event, so looking at capabilities and some of the issues to be addressed, how many injured, how many people seeking shelter. So you mentioned that there would be about 5,000 people seeking shelter. That was in the planning scenarios, and certainly considerations of the damage to the infrastructure in the downtown Houston area. You also discussed the long-term recovery considerations, being weeks to months, certainly a big crime scene, with multiple improvised explosive devices, with a car being used as a vehicle-borne mode of delivery, which is has been a mode of operating in Europe to take, for example, the Nice in France or Spain, Las Ramblas critical events. I think at some point in a discussion, Kristen mentioned that Houston had the underground 7 miles of tunnels with businesses that are open during weekdays. So, of course, special considerations around those parking facilities, and certainly considerations of the medical capability. As you know, Houston has the largest medical center in the world that connects at least 13 hospital systems and institutions, universities, clinics, and other entities that are part of that medical capability. And it was later in your discussion when you talked about what would happen if it was the healthcare critical infrastructure that was affected. So you considered that in your planning. Then you moved your discussion to a little bit more strategic or detailed geographical considerations with once the event happened, where you would establish the incident command post. You overviewed the area and looked at logical location beyond the impact zone or the hot zone. I think you identified some churches, and you had a conversation how you're going to mark it on the map, Kristen, and you marked it in blue, and that's very good because the sign for the incident command post under NIMS, it's a little white flag with a blue strip through it. So part blue, part white. Good job on that. Of course, with the event or the first explosion occurring and activation of the incident command post and making sure it was accessible, with a lot of parking space with access, and at the same time in a secure location beyond the hot zone, you started talking about hazard assessment as well as sampling and monitoring, because obviously you're not going to know in this initial event if you are dealing with issues such as dispersion of any type of malicious, be it chemical or any seaborne type of material. You also discussed I think Shawn spent some time talking about the role of SWAT and how they are not particularly, they're going to be very instrumental in a whole lot in an initial response, but they could be used for damage assessments and also rendering medical aids. Certainly, the SWAT team would have certified tactical medics with them. You also thought about the scope of this event and the necessity to have agreements in place with the private emergency medical systems, in addition to, obviously you are in this largest medical center, but if it is affected, looking at mutual aid, because Bentop, Herman Memorial, and other, St. Luke, CI, if they were to be affected, then you have to look at the hospital capacity. And you filled out you identified those hospitals for your 206. So the medical plan and medical safety plan, but you also considered, notifications to mutual aid. I think that you also mentioned, and that certainly would take place, the use of joint terrorist task forces, where there's going to be investigations. This is a huge crime scene, so your planning considerations certainly start from the moment of the impact. This is integrity of a crime scene is really important. I think Shawn discussed planning and preparedness at Texas A&M. With pre-event planning. There was a really good reflection on using those planning processes to include the forms and stuff like that in events that rally over 100,000 people. And you talked about tailgating and games and a use of a process to prepare for those situations. And I think that was very insightful that you said that those type of events create opportunities for sort of working out those processes, because it's going to be a totally different event in totally different area, certainly, but the processes remain the same. You mentioned the security for Barbara Bush funeral. Certainly those those events take a lot of planning. I had a friend who was planning the funeral for Lady Bird Johnson, and because she lived to be a pretty good old age, they were planning that for several years. So those really take a long time. I think you had some commentaries. Kristen talked about being never being a planner. Truly, you know, having different part in the event, because I think Cinthia asked if you've ever participated in an event like that or responded to an event like that. Obviously, fortunately, and hopefully for a long time, you are not going to have to. But those examples that you provided of being part of planning for significant national events is really helpful. You also talked about the notifications to the public using the emergency broadcasting. There is an emergency alert system, certainly to be leveraged texting or alternative redundancies for communications, paging, and certainly selecting the public information officers for different agencies. Now, what would happen in this event, and I don't think you mentioned that, but with public information, in the event that you selected, and any large national scenario event, you would have an establishment in Harris County of a Joint Information Center, or otherwise known as JIC. That's actually at the Harris County, a permanent structure that is set up. It's set up with telecommunications and stuff like that. And we do have Chief Public Information Officer for Harris County, who is Francisco Sanchez. There is one for City of Houston, who is a new appointee. So I'm not really sure who that is right now, but there has been a new one after Harvey. And so they would all co-locate in a joint information center. And in a joint information center, what happens, there is a media monitoring unit that monitors what the media releases. There is a rumor unit that is going to mitigate the releases or broadcasting that might be imprecise or not very actionable. There is also room there for representatives from major stations, Coast Guard, Public Works, Metro. There is a social media monitoring group that I sometimes take part in working there. And so those tweets and different processes are applied to make sure that the message that is sent to the public is consistent, and all those agencies speak with one voice. You also talked about universities having to be integrated, and their PIOs and their certainly their representatives as well. You did talk about the leadership roles and the accountability in unified command. So I really like the concept that you thought about that would be the unified command for coordination and support. And then you moved into the discussion on the operational periods and the fact that this process loops. Obviously, with the scope of this event, you are going to deal with the safety of emergency responders, fatigue, stress, trauma. And so rotation, or what's called rehabilitation, is going to be critical. And you look at planning for those factors as well, deciding what shifts or operational periods are going to be in place. Certainly maybe shorter ones initially, and then going into longer 14 to 16-hour operational periods that you suggested. The rehabilitation is key, and I'm very glad that you mentioned that and you touched on that. Certainly, you talked about moving into long-term recovery. As you mentioned, it would take weeks to months with critical infrastructure damage, and certainly with all the investigations and ongoing support to the event, particularly with respect to the injured and the victims and issues like that. And you discussed the counseling services. You talked about involvement of non-governmental organizations such as American Red Cross, Salvation Army, using them for sheltering, especially in the short-term recovery. So if you have an issue of 5,000 people seeking shelter, you would be reaching out to them. And with respect to counseling services, you did discuss chaplaincy and the availability of programs, chaplaincy programs, and as well as reunification areas, triage, treating people, releasing people, and with that comes the entire law enforcement component and making sure, and I think you did a really good job discussing that, the importance of holding the hot zone and making sure you know how evacuations take place and where the exit routes are and how witnesses are going to be debriefed. And then, of course, you discussed the in the planning process with respect to leadership, the flexibility would be key in this scenario. It would depend certainly where the first explosion takes place and how that affects availability of parking structures or movement. It's a highly congested area. And those would be management, emergency management coordination concerns. So your discussion covered, those really critical areas of a formal process. So how do you prepare, how you look at the documentation, the communication plans, the medical plans, the division, group, branch, all the assignments, how you would break this organizational structure, who agencies that are involved, and then certainly in the planning process, who you invite to the table within that, within discussions and planning. And then you move to assess what would be some mission capabilities that you have to address with respect to this particular scenario. And then you discuss the recovery. So response phase, certainly with all the management issues, staging areas and things like that, and then moving into short-term recovery and then long-term recovery. Your overview was very detailed, and I think it is a hypothetical scenario, but as I said, for situational awareness, certainly, whatever you plan in a planning session is never going to happen this way. But as you think about issues such as media monitoring, social media monitoring, the availability of alternative resources such as medical capability, there would be, I don't know if you're aware of that, and you might, in Houston, there is the Catastrophic Medical Operations Center called CMOC. So those are different hospitals and healthcare groups that share information about availability of beds, about movement of patients, about resources available, and they work very closely with CTRAC at that coordination and with different counties and their emergency management departments and emergency management coordinators. So that is really a key when you later want to look at mutual aid, because obviously with Houston being having such a huge medical capability, if that capability is taken out, then certainly most of the surrounding areas rely on Houston and not the other way around. So that Catastrophic Medical Operations Center that has different corridors works and plans for that as well. So the consideration post-blast, and when your critical incident started, would be to start thinking about those and those what-if scenarios, and that would certainly be the major preoccupation of emergency management at the time. Something that you did mention about federal resources being involved in pre-planning, obviously, because it would be a terrorist event, then based on Homeland Security Presidential Directive 5, NIMS, National Response Framework, you would have a presidential declaration of disaster. You would have some of those protocols of Stafford Act and stuff going into effect over time, and looking at those additional resources, how they would affect your planning. Certainly, FBI would be a coordinating agency for criminal investigations. It would be labeled a terrorist activity. So that coordination with the Fed would be very critical. I would assume Joint Field Office would be established at the FBI field office for that event because of its proximity to the jurisdictional area, to the area of event. You did mention Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Certainly, you would have the WMD person in charge of liaising with all those different law enforcement agencies on behalf of the FBI and all the other federal agencies. Something else to think about is that you didn't mention, but you would probably be very heavily involved with the State Department. Houston, being fourth largest in the nation, has a variety of consulates, not to mention and so dignitaries, obviously, but not to mention a lot of international business that might be affected. This would be an international event because a lot of spectators, if you look at 250,000 people, are going to be out of town. And so the diplomatic component would be very critical. So establishing that planning process department is also key in planning for an event like that. And then once this event happened, there are a lot of international issues that would come to play in Houston. So security of diplomatic installations, security of diplomats, security of foreign officials, reunification or identification, reaching out to foreign ministries to track, notify families overseas, possibly having some kind of planning for reception center for international family members that might have to come to Houston, and that would be certainly in a recovery phase, short-term recovery. But that's something to keep in mind as well, thinking a little bit outside of that traditional realm. We do have that component. And as you know, the parade is also going to have the floats and things like that. So that is the question of consideration as well. And because the people for the run and walk are, I don't recall if you mentioned credentialing for that event, but certainly that would be pre-event, and credentialing of volunteers and responders. In an event like that, credentialing would be really critical. You've got all those volunteers, and obviously they are vetted somehow initially, but then you do have the event and you have to figure out what to do with them. I think Shawn talked about, moving them to a certain area or making sure that they were not getting in the way of first responders. And certainly part of emergency management would be to figure out how to use them the most effectively. Perhaps in the recovery phase, we discuss continuous volunteers as well, and how that would, how you can plan for reshifting the focus of volunteers that might not be needed, or definitely are not needed in the hot zone, how not to just send them home, but perhaps engage them or involve them in assignments for later time. So getting the contact information, checking their skills or knowledge. You know, when you have all those counseling services, there are a lot of volunteers that are nurses, that are doctors, that are retired. So that is probably in the future a really big part of identifying those volunteers that come in a response and trying to rechannel them for those later moments where we sort of start running out of resources because the event has run its course of response, moved past short-term recovery, and now that long-term recovery sort of falls off. And certainly you did not mention the issues of rebuilding economical impact long-term, and those certainly are going to be considerations as well. I have to commend you on your Hangouts. They were excellent, all of them. So I'm still waiting for the fourth one, to view the fourth one. But this one was definitely my favorite because it was so illustrative and it was so well assessed prior to the discussion, and you exhibited a really good level of collaboration and preparation. So thank you for that, and good luck with the rest of the closing days of the semester. And I'll talk to you on the fourth one. Thanks.